we let's get started, and then as people come, I'll start to let them in because I don't want to keep people waiting. So thanks guys for joining. Really excited to introduce Brody, who's a senior technical writer at Retool, was previously at Uber and Stripe, and is going to kind of walk through some do's and don'ts, practical tips around technical writing, and then definitely like floors on you guys if you want to ask questions and workshop some things and kind of get through the nitty gritty. So I will turn it over to Brody.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. This is exciting and fun for me to do. And I hope that this is like useful and you walk away with stuff that you can sort of put into practice in sort of short term. So first up, like we're going to talk a little bit about just docs culture and stuff, but then we're going to get into more of the details of like how to get started and actually like writing docs and stuff like that. There might be some things that I mentioned that may not make sense like when I first say them, but when I think we get into some of the examples and stuff, like it'll be clear. But also as we go through this, like if you have questions, please just stop me and I'm happy to dive into whatever. So yeah, just very briefly about me, pretty much went over this. Been technical writing now for like 10-ish years. I live in Northern California with my wife and dogs and chickens and cats and stuff, and we live in the forest. So that's sort of our life in a nutshell. Also, if you hear rustling or something in the background, I do have one of the dogs with me, the younger puppy who is a little obnoxious sometimes, but he'll probably just sleep. So to jump into a little bit on just like the docs culture and value piece, we can kind of talk about this in two ways, like customer value and company value, and there's certainly overlap in there. But with docs, like they help with discoverability. That's, you know, people out in the world finding your product and using it. Another nice thing about docs is like they're a tangible thing for users to obviously use, but also share with other people. And it gets more people using your product, which sort of feeds into like the self-serve thing, which I think when companies are small, as much as we can help users help themselves, it's sort of like a one-to-many relationship, if that makes sense. Like you sort of write the docs once and maintain them, but you have that one doc set and it helps multiple people. So it just gets more people out there using your product. And while technical documentation isn't traditionally meant to like communicate product value, like usually that's like other side content like marketing materials and stuff, the docs do that because they're getting users using your product, getting familiar with them, seeing the value that they have. So they sort of have a passive product value communication piece, if that makes sense. And then on the company side, like same thing with discoverability and self-serve, but one thing that's sort of special on the company side is the source of truth. Like our products change pretty quickly. And once we get to a certain size, it's hard to keep track of what everybody is working on or the latest state of things. And if we have good docs that are at least mostly up to date, they can sort of act as that source of truth. Like how are things, you know, working now and how should it be used? And sort of the long-term benefit of docs, like they obviously grow over time, but like they sort of pay those dividends on an ongoing basis. Like you write the docs and maintain them and the value is always there. And then one final thing to mention, I didn't put it on this slide because we're pretty much focusing on external documentation, but like internal docs has a pretty special place in my heart too. And internal documentation is also valuable. And it's not something that gets a lot of visibility and stuff, obviously because it's internal, but like, you know, when you have strong like onboarding guides and things like that, like that's helpful too. It gets people up to speed faster. So it's worth sort of an honorable mention here. Okay, so to switch gears a little bit, like that was sort of the culture side and getting started, but like this is like how to actually get up and running with docs and stuff and sort of like foundational things that you can do. And the first one is to pick a style guide. This is not the most exciting thing, but style guides help a lot in basically laying a foundation. So in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter what style guide you pick. Like there's some examples here that you can totally check out. I've worked at a lot of places where we just pick one and then build on top of it. And so this helps with consistency across documentation, which is super important, but it also helps clarify like when there are questions on how to write something, you know where to look for that answer. And so the point is not like, I don't have our style guide memorized for sure, and nobody should have to do that. But like when you have questions on how to do something, you know where to go to find the answer. And everybody's going to that same spot. So it creates consistency across your docs, which is super important. And then there's sort of like a bonus here where if you have some time and resources to do something like Veil, which is a documentation linter, it basically lets you, if you've ever like written code and stuff and you have like a linter or something, it throws errors and stuff at you when there's something wrong. This does the same thing, but it's for written docs. And so it kind of goes a step further with like not having, you don't even need to know really that there's a style guide. It just needs to exist. And Veil will like, I'll show you what this looks like too, but like it throws errors and stuff for you. So you don't even have to think about it. So again, this just sort of helps. Same thing with code, like code linter, like consistency, accuracy, and things like that. Style guides, like when you do pick one, like I would encourage you to like customize it with how you need. Everybody's product is a little bit different. You might have product specific terminology, so you can build on top of that. Any questions on style guide stuff?
Can you elaborate a little bit about what it actually means to have a style guide? Like,
Yeah.
do you mean more of like,
Be a good example here. Just choose one. So a lot of times when we talk about style guides, it's like there are very simple things like how we format headers or something. Like, do we use sentence case or do we use title case? And really like the decision between that isn't super important. You just sort of need to choose one and be consistent. There's other things like how we style text for like, if you're explaining to a user how to do something within a user interface, and we say, click the submit button, whether or not submit should be bolded or in italics or something like that, it answers questions like that. And then actually the next piece I was going to jump into is kind of related to the style guide, and that's content types. And so this is like, it's sort of similar to a style guide in that like you're creating consistency and stuff. And again, it doesn't matter exactly on the content types you choose, but like one of the classic problems with docs is they're often trying to do too much. Like there might be a doc that's explaining like some architecture stuff, and then maybe there's some steps to how to do something. And those are different content types, right? Like the first part, is just sort of explaining something, but then, the actual steps are like task-based or task-oriented docs. And so I have an example here of the diataxis framework, which is not something you have to use. It's just an example. And it sounds like super fancy, but the whole point is that there's like 4 content types in this framework: tutorials, how-to guides, reference, and explanation. And they have different purposes. And so that's sort of what you want to try to get to is, and you don't need 4, but just sort of pick these content types and stick to them. And so that helps, like when you go to write a doc, it helps determine what's going to go into it. So if I'm writing, a tutorial or something like that, those are usually geared to like brand new users that aren't probably that familiar with your product. So it's very, I don't like using this phrase, we're like holding their hand, we're very intentional with helping them get through things. Whereas a how-to guide, is very task-based. The user's trying to achieve some goal, and we can assume some familiarity with their product or with your product, and like they know where they want to go. They just need help getting there. And then explanation is just like exactly what it sounds like. You're just explaining something. There's no action the user needs to take. They're just trying to learn. And then reference is like what you would think with like an API ref. To give you more of an example, like I'm using Retool docs because I'm obviously familiar with them, but our docs are not perfect. But we recently like moved to a framework like this. And so like you can see like at the top level, this is sort of product oriented, which you need to be careful about because products, it's not always going to be perfectly clear to users like what your product names mean and stuff. Sometimes it is very inherent and that's great, but sometimes it's difficult. We name things funny things sometimes. But what's important here is like between these different sections, they all start with an overview. There's a quick start, they have tutorials, guides, there's similar framework here. And why that's helpful is like when users come back to your docs looking for something, if they know that they're in this framework, they're going to know where to look. If they're trying to achieve something, some goal, they're going to know to go to guides. If they just want to see like, oh, I haven't used Retool workflows or whatever yet, let me go read their conceptual docs to learn about it. So again, it just helps with consistency and for users trying to like navigate your docs.
Quick question, Brody, if that's okay, and
Yeah,
if
of
you'll
course.
touch about it, ignore the question. But I noticed that inside your docs, like you have a more kind of actionable things on top, and then when you drill down, you get into more things that are more retool kind of stuff. So where do you set the boundary? How do you know where to use, like, terms people know versus things that are retool and kind of more educational about retool? Was wondering because the hierarchy in the docs is like kind of following some structure around it, like retool terms versus more actionable kind of terms.
Right. That is, so when you look at guides, these are very intentionally titled and stuff, because they're action oriented, right? The user's going to go do something, and that's why we have all these verbs: assemble, configure, develop, position. Like there's action and stuff here, and so that is pretty intentional. And like a lot of times when users come to docs, like there's a fair point, like you should have a good structure like this, in your sidebar and stuff for your information architecture is what it's called. But a lot of users find things through search. In fact, most times they're probably going to use Google or something or your own search, and that's how they find stuff. But the point is, like, users are usually coming to your docs to find an answer to something, and they want to do it as quickly as possible. And so having titles and stuff like this can help with that, because it's hopefully matching in their framework, like what they want to accomplish, and they can search for similar terms. The question that you have about like product specific terminology and stuff, and we definitely have this challenge at Retool, is like when to talk about those things and explain them, because there's a lot of Retool specific stuff. And like, I think you want to try to help. I think you can make an argument for focusing on like the getting started aspect of your documentation, where you're not going to get into a ton of the terminology. It's going to get users to that first, they've built that first thing or they've done that first thing, and maybe that's your priority. I have seen that happen at other places, and it sort of makes sense. You get your new users up and running, and then for this more in-depth content, that's sort of more for your advanced users. And so like when you're writing getting started content, only dive into the detail that you really need to, but I think it's okay to have some of that more detailed information, not buried, but just not up front and center, because not every user is going to need it. New users most times aren't. So it needs to be findable, but not necessarily like upfront. Does that answer your question, or start to answer your question?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, I can dive in more too. So talked about style guide, content types. For who actually writes docs, especially at smaller companies, it can be almost anybody. The things that I would say is like, try to find the person or couple of people that are excited to work about docs and work with them to get things up and running. And like I said, it could sort of be anybody. It's okay if not everybody likes docs or wants to write them and stuff. But I think like at the stage that we're at now, when your company's smaller, it's much easier to get this rolling now than when your company is really big. It's really hard to establish a docs culture once the company is, I mean, there's no specific number, but there's a certain size where it's hard to get people to care about it, I guess. So one specific piece here, this last bullet, is pretty important, and it doesn't have a perfect answer, but like if you're writing docs, or like if you're a founder writing docs and you're trying to figure out like if you should be delegating these responsibilities, one thing I would suggest is like you probably do this anyway, but like keep tabs on when writing docs is more expensive than like if you're writing them at a cost of other things. So like let's say the company's priority right now is like, we need to get more users, right? Or we need to onboard more new users. If writing docs is taking away from like that primary like company goal, then maybe it's time to delegate the docs responsibilities. And that's kind of like a case-by-case basis and how things are looking for you individually. But maybe just try to assess like, the cost of you writing documentation. And I mean, you can approach this different ways, like whether it's you or somebody else, whoever your docs person is, they could, some of the things we talked about as far as like picking a style guide and content types and things like that, someone can lay that like framework and then write some internal docs to pass that on so other people can contribute to docs, or someone else can take over the sort of the responsibilities. Does that sort of make sense? Is there anything you want to dig in deeper on that?
Yeah, so I have a question about this. I was wondering how would you manage keeping a consistent level of quality in the docs? I'd say that for us, we have quite a bit of a burden of writing docs. We have our product is evolving very quickly, so
Right.
we always need to keep adding more content and keeping it up to date and following all the changes.
Right.
But it's exactly how you say it, that sometimes the cost of keeping it up to date means that we're forced to delegate it to other people that might have more knowledge, or we might want to free someone to do that while the other person who usually maintains the docs does something else. And we
Right.
find it a bit more difficult to keep a consistent quality without, again, going back to the main maintainer and forcing them to sit through sort of like a code pull request, just making sure that the quality doesn't drop and that everything goes in properly and is understandable to the end user.
Right. So there's a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, like I said, the style guide and the content types will help with that. You probably will need to write some internal documentation that explains those things. One thing that I didn't put in this deck that you just brought up is like review, like reviews when you write docs. That is an important part of like any authoring process. And so, I mean, you don't want to have a bottleneck where it's only one person that like can review and approve these things. I think it's, in this situation, it sounds like more of getting a foundation, documenting it, and having multiple people contribute to docs is good. And maybe what happens is, you know, whoever works on a feature or something documents it, and then they get some kind of a peer review, just like you would with code review, where they just read it with that kind of an eye, where maybe they don't, you know, look at quite at the technical details, but more of just like the quality of the writing and stuff like that, and asking questions of like, you know, does this, you know, if this is supposed to be a guide, does it follow, you know, our requirements for a guide and things like that. I mentioned Veil, the docs linter. That is also something that you can build into like a GitHub action or something like that, where you check these style guide things automatically. And you can make it so it just throws like, I forget the actual like level, but it's like a suggestion. It won't block the pull request, but it will flag all of these things with your style guide. And that would, you know, if you, I guess I've set Veil up a couple times, so I don't think it's too difficult, but like in probably an hour or two, you could have something at least locally set up that could help with some of those basic questions, like, or those style guide questions that just get automatically captured. Trying to think of something else. I mean, I think deciding on a base level of quality or trying to is worth it. And that quality might be different depending on the company and stuff like that. You know, maybe it's just consistent headers, consistent content types, and we don't have any typos. You know, something like that, it can be good too. And typos are something, you know, anybody can fix. A lot of times, you know, you catch them automatically. You don't need to consult a style guide or anything like that. Does that sort of help?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Trying to think of anything else on the slide. Yeah, like I said, you might have people building the features, document them if you can. I mean, with the stage that you're in, I don't know like if you have any writers or whatever, but like if you had technical writers, like obviously you could have them always do these reviews, and that would help a lot with consistency. But that's difficult to do sometimes depending on like company size and everything. And then a quick note on docs tooling. I would suggest early on you pick something easy to use. You want as few barriers as possible to writing docs. And usually with something like README or GitHub Pages, and there's a ton of other site generators that you can use, are fairly easy to get up and running. And I generally suggest using a Git-based workflow and writing in Markdown. There's a couple of reasons for that. Like if you have developers that are writing docs, like GitHub is familiar to them, that workflow and everything is familiar. And writing in Markdown is fairly, like Markdown is pretty commonly used. And even if it's not, if someone's not familiar with it, the syntax is pretty easy to get started with. But then also, like, let's say you get your docs started, things are going good, but then you find your authoring system, whether it's README or GitHub Pages or something, doesn't do what you want it to do anymore, and you want to migrate to something else. Migrating Markdown content is much easier than migrating, you know, like pure HTML or something like that. Like, it's much easier to just like copy paste that stuff over and get another site to generate it. So sort of another reason to probably go Markdown at this point. And like I said, I think in the beginning stages, you might see a docs tool that has lots of bells and whistles and stuff, but sometimes that's not really useful until later stages, or if your docs really need to do complex stuff. If you need like, if you have like crazy versioning requirements, or you want to embed these like certain demos or something, or you want to do like custom JavaScript or something in your docs, then maybe something like that later on is worth it. But I think something like this to start out is usually the way to go. And then just a quick note on like how technical docs relate to other site content. Like the technical docs should explain how to use your product. And you know, things like marketing materials and stuff like that content, it's good to have sort of a separation between your technical docs and other content. And that doesn't mean that they can't talk about the same stuff. In fact, you really want consistency in the parts that do overlap. And so like an example here is like, let's say your product is translated into 20 languages. And let's say on the marketing site, it says, you know, translated in 20 languages, but then somewhere in your technical docs, it says translated into 15 languages. Like that causes confusion for the user. So which is it, 15 or 20? Like what languages are they? You know, that starts asking questions. And so like, it's an example where you're sort of talking about the same thing. And so you need that consistency. So like, if you do have that, that's really cool. But just sort of think about maintaining that separation, but consistent content. All right. So this part is more of like the workshop space. I'm going to go over a couple things up front, but like this is sort of like the actual writing portion. And so like definitely let me know if you have questions. With technical writing, like, yeah, go for it.
Sorry. Quick question. So so like Retool is like a builder tool, right? Like you explain a lot about like the building blocks of how to kind of do stuff. So how do you the reason I'm asking it is because Poet is also like a builder tool for other use case. So so what is like the balance of kind of explaining about the tools themselves rather than demonstrating them and explain how they can come into practice? So, you know, there is a fine line between you want people to be able to imagine what you can do with the tools rather than kind of explaining what are the actual tools. So how do you kind of balance these two things?
Good question. I think as far as trying to communicate like what you can do with the tool, you might even use resources that aren't docs. Or something that we do a lot in our docs is we have usable demos at the top. So like you don't even have to read the doc, but you can kind of play with the thing that you're going to build. And so you don't have any knowledge about the pieces, but there's a demo up there. And so having demos or templates, I think unfortunately our YouTube channel is probably in various stages of being out of date, but like, you know, tutorials and things like that people can watch can sometimes communicate like sort of the use case and what you can actually build much faster than docs can. The docs, I think, help out the most in sort of providing the guidance on how to get to these places. But as far as like showcasing, like, you know, this is sort of the valuable pieces or what you can build, there might be other options that you can use. And so demos and things go a long way. As far as like explaining, I think this sort of relates to content types maybe, where like you might have sections of your docs that talk about use cases or something like that. And that covers more of the high level stuff, sort of the end product and what you get and what it looks like. And those would be like a separate content type or something. But then the actual like building blocks and like how to do stuff is, you know, the detailed guides that are like step-based or whatever. Again, when like explaining like product specific terminology and things like that, it's a tough question because my base level recommendation is like you focus on as narrow a scope as you can on that feature. right? Like you just dive into that one thing, explain it. But what happens, and this is natural for products, we build features so that they can work together to do something. And that's when it gets difficult, when it's like we're combining these 3 features. And that's when you really need to explain the connectors, like how those things relate to each other. Like, I will not use the company name, but I worked somewhere previously where like we did a really good job of explaining individual features, but a really terrible job of talking about how those features fit together. And early on in your product, you may not need that. It may do very basic, straightforward things where you can talk about them individually, but keep in mind, like as your product grows, think about that and how they fit together. And that's when you might have, there's sort of an unavoidable point, I think, where our products naturally get more complex to meet users like needs, right? And so there is a level of complexity there. I think that's somewhat unavoidable depending on what you're trying to do. But that again is like those content types, like that kind of content is usually for like your more experienced users, your power users. And so with that kind of content, I think it is okay to assume some base level of familiarity with your product and some of these terms, right? Like it's unlikely maybe that a brand new user who's looking at our product for the first time today is going to jump into one of these like extremely like, I don't know, esoteric, probably not the right word, but like specific use case that's very complex, they'll build up to that. And so I think that in technical docs, we try not to assume that the user knows, too much, but in these cases, when things are more complex, I think we have to do that. And what you do is in that guide, you let people know up front, we're like, hey, if you haven't used this thing before, or if you're not familiar with it, you might want to go, read these docs or do this thing first and then come back here. Sorry, that's kind of a ramble.
No, it makes sense. And maybe one more question, and sorry for asking so many.
It's great.
So some of the things like, they're just like self-explanatory from the UI of the application, and some of them like needs to be documented. So how do you decide what you put in the docs, and what do you prefer people just to understand from the product?
That is also a great question. So it can be a tricky line to define, but like this kind of goes back to assuming some baseline familiarity with like using products and things like that. Like if you're explaining how to do something in a UI or something, like you shouldn't have to probably explain to people like, this is obviously a ridiculous example, but like you don't have to say like move your mouse to the left and then 20 pixels, up and stuff. And so like find your line between that and not giving the user like any help. Like there is, so one of the arguments I've heard about this for many years is like when a UI is well designed, it doesn't really need documentation, right? If it's intuitive and stuff, then users should just be able to figure that out. For me, I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think you still want a well-designed product, obviously, and that can make things intuitive. But like I said, once our products get to a certain level of complexity, it's not really that simple anymore. And so you do need to explain to users. And so like, while you do not need to explain maybe each action that they make with a mouse, saying something like, go to the resources tab, click on this button, and then do this. Like that level of detail, I think is fine. Maybe if I had an example in front of me, I might be able to provide a better like guidance, but like I don't like, if you know your users well enough, you might be able to get an idea of like what base level understanding that they have, which will help determine like how much detail you need to provide in these different areas. Like if I'm writing technical docs for less technical people, I'm going to go into way more detail on like how code works and what things should look like and stuff like that. But if I know I'm writing for developers, there's certain things I know that I can skip. I don't need to explain what a function is to them and things like that. So, and if you have any sort of feedback mechanism, whether it's like customer interviews or feedback mechanism in your docs, like just listen to that, because people will read through your page and they'll be like, this does not make sense to me. We don't always get useful feedback. Sometimes it's like very general and we don't know what to do, but other times they can say, you kept talking about functions in this doc and I have no idea what they are. And so if you have a good avenue with your users to get feedback on docs, that might be a way that will help you figure out how much detail a certain doc or set of docs needs. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
The most important thing on this slide is the last bullet. And it sounds really generic and silly, but like, if your product is fairly easy to use and stuff, your docs are going to be good. Like if your product is well designed, then your docs are going to be that way too. And so like on the flip side of this, like let's say it takes like 10 steps for users to do something in your product or whatever. The docs aren't going to make that better. It's not going to make it 5 steps. Like in a lot of ways, if things are sort of clunky in the product, the docs expose it even more because we're explicitly like talking about these things. And so it's a lot easier to write great docs when the product is simple. And like I said early on, maybe things are simple. Obviously things get more complex, but like if it's well designed, it makes it easier to write docs. A really quick list of do's and don'ts for like just the writing portion of this. So like I mentioned earlier that like users come to docs usually to figure something out, answer a question, get something done as fast as possible. And that's why technical docs need to be concise. And it's another reason why like your question about like how much detail and stuff to go into is a really good question to ask. Because if you go into tons of detail, the docs are less concise. And even though I am a writer and I hate to admit this, but I do the same thing. A lot of times when you go to docs, you don't read them first. You go to a doc, you skim it first and figure out if this is even what you need. You might just go to one step and then read that and get what you need and leave. And that's fine. Like we want our docs to be skimmable. That's why we have good headers and things like that. But to be concise, it really just means using present tense. That means we're writing about things happening now, not in the past, not in the future. Active voice, like I said, this link on the Be Concise is actually a video where I talk about this in more detail. It's like 13 minutes. You can watch it. It goes into more explanation here. But like active voice just means your subject is taking the action, which I'll show an example of this so it makes sense. And then the third bullet of practicing cutting content is like a valuable skill. And all of these things just come with practice. And you don't have to like do a ton of it. You just sort of over time get used to it, where you figure out when you look at a sentence, if there's a word that you can take out and it doesn't change the meaning, take it out. Like if it's not adding anything and it doesn't make it confusing for the user, just remove it. We talked about content types. If you are documenting a UI, using images sparingly is important just because images are more difficult to keep up to date than text itself. And then do what you can to keep your docs up to date. Taking time. Okay. So I have a couple examples here. We'll do the first one, and then I'm going to take a break and ask you all some questions. So like this first doc, we're just going to sort of briefly critique together at sort of like a high level and like content type level. And so like for me, I know that we're in the guide section. I would expect this to have steps in it. We're going to achieve some goal. We're going to do something. We're going to learn how to do something. This is all good. I see the steps here. This makes sense to me generally. But then once we get to the JavaScript method stuff, like this is where I start to see this doc is trying to do too much. Like we're doing two different things. We're telling the user how to do something, and then we're also providing reference material here, which really should live somewhere else. So like this should basically be two different docs or split out. So like if we were going to rewrite this as sort of like a high, and this stuff here, you know, this information is good. I would actually have I probably rewrite it, but this should be at the top of the doc, right? So users know upfront, like, is this what I want? Is this what I care about? Yes or no? And so valuable information, probably don't want it at the bottom of the doc. So like, I would probably move this stuff up. JavaScript methods should live something in like a reference doc or something. And then we could link to that doc from here and then just rewrite this stuff. So at like a high level, like content type, that's probably what we do. Like this should be a guide. This should be reference, split it out. Doc's doing too much. So the other example I was going to run into is like a live editing thing. But I know we've been going for a while and I've been talking a lot. Is there like, should I jump into that? Do you want to look at your examples? Do you have questions? Like, I know I moved fairly fast, but I will pause there.
I have a maybe kind of a silly question, just something that comes up a lot when we write docs, or it's like two things. One, if you have a preference or if you have some advice about like, because you kind of said using an active voice, I think you wrote, if I'm not mistaken. a lot of times, sometimes you write, let's do this, or you should do this, or or like, is it a you, is it we, is it us together? If you have
Yeah,
like a preference or any
absolutely.
advice on that.
Yeah, this is another thing that would go like in your style guide, or you probably inherit from a style guide if you picked one. What we do is like, we never use we, it's always Retool. So instead of saying something like, we recommend you do this thing, it would be Retool recommends that you do this thing. It's okay to use we, it's definitely like a less formal thing. And there is like, it's okay to be a little bit informal in technical docs, but the standard is usually like pretty formal stuff. And so we would use Retool recommends. We do use you a lot, but almost never we. But if you are talking through a user through like a guide or something, you might say like, you know, you need to enable this on this page for users to do it or whatever. You is totally fine. Also slightly related, when you say like, if you say something in your doc like, you know, Retool recommends or strongly recommends, a lot of times in that specific situation, like you might just want to tell the user to do the thing instead of just saying you recommend or something. Just tell them to do it, especially if you know if they don't do it, they're going to stumble on something later on. Instead of even making it a recommendation, just be like, you need to go do this thing, because I mean, they're not going to know the difference. And if you're setting them up for success later, like it's kind of worth it. But if it really is like an optional thing where you don't know their situation well enough where you can tell them to do it, you can just say, you know, we recommend, or optionally you can do this thing. But yeah, does that help?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other like questions like that, as far as like, I don't know, like standards and things and working that way?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a question following up on what Zara asked. So we have received some feedback on our documentation from clients, and one thing that we noticed is there's a broad spectrum of competency in our clients. We sometimes have incredibly technical and well-versed clients that go in and only use our documentation, don't talk to us at all, and achieve amazing things. And on the other hand, we sometimes find that customers that are a bit struggling a bit more, and they might even come to us and tell us, we look at your documentation, we understand that it contains all of the information that we could possibly need, but we're overwhelmed by it and we don't exactly know how to navigate it. And so we find ourselves struggling in how to balance the level of technicality, because
Right.
on the one hand, really hand-holding the, let's say, a bit more struggling customers would bring more overhead, and I guess that it might also cause the more technical customers to sort of run away from documentation, saying, hey, this is too much for me, I don't need this, I can do stuff on my own. So I was wondering if you have like a way to understand how to exactly balance that to make sure that you get sort of a middle ground that people can effectively use.
Yeah. So a couple things come to mind. I think that I'll show you some examples like in our docs where I think you try to serve like both audiences because they are sort of different. But like, I think it's also worth saying that like, as much as I don't want to say it, it is true. Like it's very right, a doc that works for all users. And that's why it's important to like, if you can, find a priority. Like if your priority is getting new users up and running, then that's the content that is like front and center, is very easy to follow, and is like the stuff that you maintain the most or whatever. Some examples like, so for like really new users that are either not very technical or really are not understanding Retool, the tutorial section is kind of what this is for. Like specifically this is where we go into a lot more detail talking about some of it's Retool stuff, some of it's not, just because like you can write JavaScript and stuff. And so this, like your tutorial content might be geared towards those users that are not as up to speed or whatever as your other users that are struggling. And so you have them do something like this first. What would help, one thing that we're not really doing here is like, you can do things to sort of signpost in your docs to try to get users to the right spot. And so this landing page is more of like just like a high level product overview or something, but I could see another page here where it's like, if you don't know where to go in our docs, let us tell you. And what the page would be like, hey, you know, if you're an experienced developer and you've used our product before, or you're somewhat familiar with it, go see these docs. They're probably what you want. If you're brand new and aren't sure where to start, go start with this tutorial where we're going to like really explain these things and help you through it. So you can write sort of different, you can write for different audiences. Those docs should be sort of separate in some way, obviously. But know that like it's hard to satisfy every single person. And so you sort of pick, like find a priority and try to make sure that you're hitting that priority and then sort of do what you can. Now it feels bad because you want to do everything for all of your users, but it is kind of like, especially when resources are limited, like on the authoring side and stuff, like sometimes you have to sort of pick priorities like that. The other thing that you can do is like, I don't know if we do this. We might have removed it. Like, well, this is a good enough example. Like in this prerequisite section, like we talk about some things that you should be familiar with. So like this, well, like if you can put these things in, this is sort of what I meant by like signposting, where like if a user gets here and they don't know these things or aren't familiar with them, they know to go learn a little bit more. Or if this was like product specific stuff, let's say, I don't know, someone was going to get started with like workflows, but let's say they needed, this is a fake example, but like, let's say before you get started here, you should really learn about resources first. Like we can say those things and have people go read other things. Something that I haven't done, but I wanted to try too is like, you sort of have a page that's just a collection of your own resources where it's like, hey, if you want to get started with workflows, this is Retool's recommended path for doing that. So go read this doc, go work through this quick start, build your thing, and then scope out your own project and build your stuff. So you could do something like that where you have like roadmaps for users to use your docs and stuff. I think that would be an interesting experiment. I can't, like I said, I have not gotten to try it, but like when your doc's set, if they're having trouble navigating it, like one thing will help is the content types and having like a consistent information architecture, but then you might also be able to provide some guided, like, this is a set of docs you want. So any other questions? Any other examples you want to like jump into?
I have some more general questions. So
Shoot.
if you want to move on and then we'll get back to them. So.
I mean, I'm go for it. I love questions.
Cool. So the first one is how we think about engaging users with your documentation. We're quite early. We currently have no documentation. So everything is done by the team with the customers. But we want to kickstart that and see them using and improve the experience of the product, like get their onboarding faster.
Okay. So you mean like, I'm not sure I quite follow, like working through them, like watching them work through your docs and use them?
Well, I mean, our end users, the data teams, so they're not developers, they do use documentation as part of the daily workflows, but not as extensively. And just that we have, like every single piece of our product, we need to engage them with our documentation as well, and tutorials and how-tos.
So I'm sorry, I think I'm so confused. Is these different users that you're trying to get using your documentation and like they are struggling or they don't know?
We currently have no documentation. Not used to working with documentations in general. It's like at least most of them are understanding. And well, you know, maybe another take on this question is how you measure the effectiveness of your documentation.
Right.
The other side of the coin.
Yeah, that question is one of the ones I think I've struggled with the most. Like, there are certain basic metrics that you can use, like, but they never tell the whole story. And that's why, like, any metrics that you get on your docs, like page views, upvotes, downvotes, those things, those are all useful, but like, you need to take them in context and also get like the qualitative feedback from users. Because like the most popular page at a place that I worked at was some error pages, had like hundreds of thousands of views, and it had the worst ratings. It always did, because it was an errors page. Users going there have hit an error and they're unhappy. And so like that page was the most popular and always like downvoted the most. And so like there are basic metrics that if you can collect are worth it, but effectiveness is like, I think probably, even though it's not a perfect answer, like the best is direct user feedback. Like I successfully achieved what I wanted to with this doc and it helped me. Depending on if you can get that feedback or not, obviously is like a different question. Like there are different, depends on the doc system and stuff like that. We usually track some base level CSAT, like customer satisfaction score or whatever. And that tells us a little bit. The baseline that I think we shoot for is like 60%, which sounds like pretty low, but like it's just sort of like a way for us to track how we're doing. And again, like I said, it's really difficult to write docs that are going to be perfect for every single user. But if we know that like our CSAT is hovering in the 60 to 70% range, and these are the docs, like it's all right. But yeah, effectiveness is something hard to track. I still have not seen at any of the places I worked like a proper, like a perfect way of doing it. But yeah.
Just wondering if you see any way to take your product metrics and the corresponding maybe tutorials, how-tos, and see if they are somehow correlated. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, totally. I think anytime you can like, yeah. One thing that I didn't mention is like the docs and stuff, to me, like you should really consider them like part of the product. And so like you should look at them together with the product itself and like how users are using the product and the docs and how they relate to them. Like if users are having a hard time with this part of the product, are they even looking at the docs? Can we figure that out? Or, is that connection being made? Because that would be really telling. Like maybe it's time for us to put some links in our product to the docs. So when users like hit these spots, they know that there's like a resource for them and they can go directly to it, stuff like that.
Well, cool. So the idea of integrating the docs into your product is part of the engagement thing. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
That was the first one. Second one is related to technical content that is on the border between marketing content and documentation. It's really popular now with the take OpenAI APIs and Product X, and this is how you combine them together. And it's not like the marketing use case, but it's a step-by-step guide on how to do that. So your thoughts, tips, frameworks, whatever for that.
Right. I mean, I think what mostly comes to mind is just like the two like types of content have different goals, like the stuff that's on your marketing site and other things like that. Like, I can't speak as much on that side just because I've never really worked in like that sort of side of the business and stuff. But like, their goals are like different. And so the presentation of that information, there's usually like obviously visuals and things like that that are a little bit more tangible or whatever than docs. For maintaining, like at least I guess in my experience, there's not a ton of overlap. There is some but like they are fairly different content types where like, and you can also like rely on each of those to link towards each other. So if I'm writing something in technical documentation, and let's say like something that we very rarely talk about in technical docs is pricing. But pricing is super important, but it's not something we usually talk about in technical docs. And so if we have to talk about it, I'm usually linking out to the marketing or site pages that explain that, because it's going to have the most up-to-date information, and like the information that the user needs is there. So like really don't duplicate unless you have to, or there's a good reason to duplicate that sort of information or content. Like it goes both ways. You can link to each other for that sort of information. I think too, like, this is only sort of like kind of related, but when it's really tempting for us to talk about roadmap stuff and what we're building for users, especially in like these smaller areas, like we wanted them to know that like, hey, you've been asking for this feature and like it's coming. And technical docs, like, I won't tell you not to do this, but like the basic rule is to not do that. In the very worst cases, it can be like legally binding, which is obviously bad. We're like, oh, we're building this thing. And then if you end up not building it and users know that, then it can cause, like I said, in extreme cases, legal issues. In minor cases, they're just unhappy, you know? So be really careful about how you communicate roadmap stuff, regardless of whether it's in technical docs or your marketing site. Like you can take it on a case-by-case basis, but like how you communicate what you're working on is something to, especially in technical docs, be careful about, because technical docs should really just focus on like, this is how the product works today, and here's how you use it, because you want to be careful about making promises for the future, because as we know, like things change super fast, products change, you know, we might start building this one product and like pivot to something else. And so I guess that's another thing to keep in mind when looking at those content types.
Thank you. Perfect.
Anything else? Other examples, questions on stuff? Let's see. Yeah, I don't know how, if it would be useful or not, but I can jump into like a live editing thing. I don't know, like I said, if you're all writing, this might be helpful. I won't do like an entire doc. Dude, it's okay, chill out. But I guess, does that sound all right? And also ask questions and stuff like as we go through this. I'm probably gonna reshare my screen though. I guess first, like, I'll explain first what we're gonna do. So like, this is a doc that we're gonna rewrite soon. It's an example of another doc that's just doing like way too much. And so I'm gonna go through and like look at the source, like the markdown for this, and just edit, like live edit, to talk a little bit through like some like tech writing fundamental stuff. But definitely stop me anytime you have questions and stuff. So now let me reshare my screen. Okay. Oops. Can you see this? Whoa. All right. Okay. So to get started here, like our title and stuff is fine. It's sort of action oriented. We're going to connect to something and we know what we're going to do. We're going to learn how to do this thing. And then this first sentence is mostly good, but like this piece right here, the fast and useful, isn't something that we would normally put into docs. The reason that we would take out fast and useful, especially fast, is like sort of talking about like the different audiences and stuff. There's someone that might go through this and it might be fast and they'd be very happy and then they're done. But if it's not familiar to them or they haven't done it before and it's not fast, then it's kind of like, it's not insulting, but like it doesn't feel great, right? Like, so we would really just take this out. And really, this isn't the important part. The important part is that, you know, we can build these CRUD apps on top of our data and stuff. And so one, it reduces the length of the sentence and gets more to the point here. We can just get rid of this. This is like HTML block example stuff. We talked about tense a little bit. I'll just spell this out. Usually this would be like you will. This is future tense, so like it's happening in the future. And this is like a small thing, but like we can just get rid of will. And that's only one word difference here, it's one word shorter. But when you look at a doc, especially one this big, you're going to cut tons of these words. And so it's a small thing that adds up. So we don't, you know, we just change this to happening now. This is like hyperbole, which we would never put into docs. That's fine. Here's like a style guide example thing. So like we have, this is in our UI. So we have the resources tab that's in the UI. We have a create new button and we have an API section. This isn't styled at all. And then these are in quotes. And so like, this is where like style guide consistency helps. And like, this is where something you don't need to necessarily know this, but you see the inconsistency, you go look at your style guide and figure it out. So like if this was ours, this should be bold. Pretty much everything in our UI is bold. Should be capital, bold. And then same thing, actually. Yeah, there should be both too. So again, with like style guide stuff, that would help in these situations where you're just styling things consistently. Here again, we have future tense, like here's what you'll need to provide. You can just say you. So this is another example of just finding words you can cut. None of the stuff we cut here is really necessary. The user still needs to know like these are the things. And then to show you veil real quick, you can see there's lots of problems with this doc. But like, this is what I was talking about. This is all veil. So we have rules written that show things. So like, it's telling us to check the spelling here. And you can just click on the thing and it goes to the word and stuff. And so we have a ton of terminology that we like use and stuff. So we have style guide checks for that. I mean, if you're interested, I can show you the rules and stuff for this too. But like, basically, this just helps with style guide stuff where you don't even have to know the style guide exists. I mean, somebody has to build the rules and stuff, but then it just sort of spits things out at you. And some of these are just like suggestions, like things you should check out. So like we use sentence case, but obviously like Firebase is an actual thing, like it's sort of like a proper noun, so it should be capitalized and things like that. So yeah, is there any like, I guess like writing specific questions or things that I can help out with?
I guess a question I have, I think this is also like a little bit about personal style, but what do you think about, like, we talked about how there are different types of content, and I know that oftentimes for us, like a lot of times we kind of try to tell a story, but sometimes in technical content, like it kind of depends if it's a tutorial or if it's a guide. But oftentimes like we're trying to tell a story and then it can make the whatever we're writing a lot more lengthy. So just like, what are your opinions on that?
Sure. I think that like if you have like I think it's totally cool and like okay to do those things. I think you're right that like they should be in sort of like a clear space in your docs where like this tutorial doesn't quite do that, but like we do talk about like what you're going to build and like it's a user management like dashboard and stuff. And I think that content is super useful for those like newer users where they're trying to contextualize like what they can do and like and for that type of writing, it's okay to be a little bit more like wordy or explanatory. I think that's totally okay. One of the tricky things with writing is honestly knowing when to break the rules. Like we have all of these like style guide rules and things like that, and most times they apply. But if you have stuff like this, like use case based things and stuff, like it's a totally valid content type. What you can also do is like, if you really want the separation and you have like a blog or something, you could also put that stuff into like a different site or whatever. And it can be like your use case site. And that's the sort of content type that goes in there. I think you're right for like more like task oriented docs, like those user kind of already has an idea of what they want to do. So you can like be more concise, but like, yeah, with stuff like that, it totally has like a place and like a useful area to be. And oftentimes like we know people learn differently, right? Some people don't want to read, they want to be shown. And that's why like, I mean, it can be expensive in terms of like resourcing and stuff, but that's why like having videos are great, having demos are great, having docs are great. It's hard to have it all, but like that content type that you explained is like, it's good to have, and it explains your product in ways that are often a little bit more, not tangible, but just like, for some users, they get it a lot faster when it's explained that way.
Cool, thanks.
Is there anything that I went over that was like, that completely did not make sense, dude? Like, what are you talking about? Right. I mean, that's pretty much all I had. I can go like I said, I wasn't sure like how valuable the live editing thing would be, or if like you're all writing, but I can do that for hours because I do that every day. But I'm happy to do more of that or just talk about anything, docs, your docs, other companies' docs, although probably have to be careful about that. All right, is there anything, I guess like, if you have feedback for me, like now or after, as far as what would have been helpful or anything? definitely let me know. Like I said, it's fun to do these sorts of things. I hope that at least some of it was useful for your day to day. But yeah, if there's anything else, anything docs related, I'm happy to jump into it.
Also, just making sure you'll send the slide chapter, right? I think you said
Yeah.
that again. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'll probably clean out like, yeah. I don't think there's anything I need to scrub. I don't know how interested you all are in my notes, but like I'll definitely share the slide deck and some of the links and stuff. Like, I think especially as much as I hate the video because it's me talking more, but like the Be Concise video is like probably does a better job of like the live editing explanation than what like we did here. And like it's a fairly quick thing. And like a lot of technical writing, it's sort of practice. Once you do it a little bit, you don't even think about these things anymore, and it becomes a little bit more second nature. And the other thing that's nice about technical writing is that it's sort of, to me, applicable across roles. So it kind of doesn't matter what you're doing. Being able to effectively write is a resume-worthy skill. But also, like, I think it's awesome that all of you are thinking about docs in whatever capacity, even if it's a small way. Like, the companies that I have worked for that thought about docs early on have been my favorite place to work at, obviously. But I think it's something not everybody thinks about. But it, and a lot of times you don't want people to think about your docs because like it's just a lot of times they're going there when there's like a problem or something. But like everybody needs them. They're almost always there. So it's worth sort of looking at now.
Well, I think that was for me that was super useful. We're just getting started with these things. Right now, everything is manual. The entire team is on every single customer, which makes things much more like it's easier, but it does not scale. And well, I think that if you have a few more examples that you can send us of documentation sites that you really like, that you think they did awesome jobs in different domains. We're a data infrastructure company, so things look a bit differently. And well, so references are awesome and always a good way to get started and get inspiration. You know, maybe some of more the technical side, some of them more on the like less technical user side could be a great inspiration.
Yeah, I can definitely look around for some examples. I think there's a couple that come to mind. I'll include that with like the slide deck and stuff. And then, yeah, I'm also on LinkedIn and stuff. So if you think of questions or anything like after this, like I'm always happy to chat and stuff too. Cool. I think I'll probably stop the recording. I think it should be fine. Mia made me like co-presenter, so I think it should be good. Thank you for taking the time. I think that it's sort of late there, so I hope it's not too late. But yeah, it was really great to talk to you all.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Brody.
Thanks, Brody.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.